Javier. How you doing, Javier?
I'm good. I'm good.
I'm good. Well, I'm good now that I've seen you. You doing okay? I enjoyed our talk with Trey immensely. That was a great joy.
Yeah, that was really good talk.
That was extremely good, even though you kept me up until like 2 a.m. because we spoke for about 4
hours.
I
blame you. I blame you for that.
You are supposed to be taking responsibility for your choices. You own a cat, I don't, therefore it's your fault. That's pretty clear, all right? Pretty self-evident and different things. All right, tell me what you're telling me about the void stuff with relations and Buber, so on.
Well, I mean, it's still a work in progress, but I mean, the way I'm thinking is like, okay, Buber talks about meeting and there's only relation and everything like that. And then also you get a hint of...
Wait a minute, Thomas Jockin, look at that guy. How you doing, Mr. Jockin? You doing all right?
Doing well.
Excellent. Javier is telling us about Buber and relations and the void in different states. All right, Javier, go on.
So in Between Man and Man, Buber talks about this very short little passage about God moment or moment God. So that's where I started getting the hints of like this Buber type of void, where there must be like some implicit void going on in like Buber's philosophy, because obviously he reduces God in some aspects to like a moment, or an event. So I've been thinking void is a better term for nothingness, because void really captures the movement of nothingness, kind of like how it moves. So that's how I've been looking at it.
Well, no, that's very interesting. And Sam, Chetan, Tyler, great to see you today. Everyone, I will repeat this again. You must go to Sam's site and watch all her Kafka reflections, the ones she just put out. I don't hear anyone talk about the circus story that you did, Sam. And I thought the way that you reflected on that was outstanding. And Chetan, I've started the paper. I love it. You've done wonderful work. So well done there. Javier is going over a little bit of Buber and the void. He and we had a great talk with Trey at Telospound, where we were kind of almost talking about a philosophical developmentism, as I almost want to call it, following a phenomenological journey in Hegel, which is the idea that you move from, say, ego is to I suchness, and how to go then I you, and almost an I you absolute knowing stage, and how there are different philosophers that can help one develop in that process. So that was a really interesting discussion that we had. And Javier, because he likes to harass me in direct messaging on Twitter, was talking to me about the notion of a void potentially in Buber, which I think what you're saying, Javier, is very interesting, because there is this sort of question of if there is not an IU going on, then what is going on? Do we want to just call it nothing? Well, nothing really doesn't capture it, right? Seem like you're saying like a language of a void. Obviously, Mr. Jock and I, we've all done work on lack, which is the present absence, which is quite good. And I do think, like we talked about with Trey, Javier, there is this kind of question on, how does one get to the place where they can hold an IU relationship, witness it, as opposed to possess it, right? That's very, very difficult. And there seems to be some kind of quote unquote void that one has to work through, or some sort of space to that. So I think what you're saying is interesting.
Yeah, I think to go with what you said about lack, I think phenomenologically speaking, when we talk about experience, I would say void, in my opinion, you can't experience void, you can only experience lack. Sort of like, it's because the void exists that you can experience lack. That's kind of like the way I look at it. But yeah, I'm trying to develop this idea of like, it's how you have this turning towards or away from the void that you can experience Buber's God moment or not God moment.
To sort of, I think, repeat myself, because Thomas and I think Javier, we have been discussing this in our reading group, which is stagnant for some time now, I think. When we think about void, we need to think about void not in terms of zero, but in terms of -1. And I think Kadupanchik would put it in that sense, that if there is simply zero, if there is simply absence, that is never that controversial a problem in philosophically speaking. In that sense, what you have is never a zero. What you have is something like an absence presence, as much as presence absence, in that sense, that you have you already have something there which needs to be supplemented at all points of time. You already have a -1 in some senses. You're starting from a -1. You're not starting from 0 in that form of thinking. So when you start from -1, then the problem becomes much more complex. And the problem is not simply trying to think about this question of void between subject and the object. Then the problem becomes insane. Hegel says question of self-consciousness. And how do you treat your own consciousness as a subject? And it is only then you can treat another consciousness as a, how do you treat your own consciousness as an object? It is only then you can treat another consciousness as a subject. This splitting, this doubling in that sense is extremely essential. It's not like there is no object, it is only I and you. It's never I and you. There's always something else accompanying it, which is your capacity to treat yourself as an object in some senses. And how do you start thinking through that?
No, that's what. And Emilio and Cadell, wonderful to see you today. And on what you're saying there, Chita, it's almost like thinking of Sam's recent piece on the Circus story. It would be nice to believe that the internal state of people was a 0, right? Like it was just kind of a 0, but it's actually kind of a -1. It's something that's there and below, and therefore you have to take it into consideration. Kafka, as we've been talking about, is always playing on this disconnect between the external circumstance and the internal state. The determinations, if we use from the philosophy of right at the beginning of abstract right, that the subject finds themselves facing, and what do they do about it? And you have that tragedy described in the story that Sam brought out, and feel free to talk about it, Sam, because I love your work on Kafka, is really kind of how we as human beings find ourselves caught in that situation, and how because like I was saying, Sam and I were talking on the idea that the performer in the circus really actually is kind of always forced to perform, but because they can go home and take breaks and have different days, it seems like it's broken up. But if someone was literally forced to perform 24/7 their entire life, like people would run down on the stage and stop it because it would clearly be torture. But the play is that actually the performer, and Sam overlays it with the woman very, very well, is in a state of constant performance. It's just because externally it doesn't look like that we're okay with it and we allow it to happen. But actually there's a quote unquote -1 state. There's a deeper state that's going on that actually maybe the idea of 0, if you're not careful, can actually function as a sort of self-deception to make you think that that's not there and has to be taken care of because it's a kind of nothingness. So I like what you were saying.
I apologize for repeating because Shaitan, we talked about this in the book club with Javier, because this discussion of a double, not only is this kind of double negate, this double effect of not only do you have to do this objectification of the self and then do this kind of weird dance with another, you're using this analogy of the -1 compared to 0. I'm making in my mind what we talked about in the book club together, the square root of -1. Basically imagine it's basically a double negation or a double impossibility in a way, right? So the square root of the incommensurability of the right angle of a triangle, this one demonstration, we had that as a kind of impossibility. And then we have this -1 as an impossibility. So this tacking of it, maybe that articulates that spirit. It's kind of artistic painting of that idea. Just want to share that.
Absolutely. Actually the question of the -1 is actually the question in that sense that you don't have simple multiplicity. The problem multiplicity is that you can never have simple multiplicity. If you can ever have simple multiplicity, which can completely disconnect from each other, then Hegel is not needed in some senses. Hegel becomes operationalized precisely because there's something about multiplicity that keeps on there's something about multiplicity that keeps on hounding it from within itself to move forward, for that movement to take place. It is in that sense that you have to think about relationship between I and the you and I and the other in that sense. So there is something hounding that relationship even before, and it's not a hounding in that sense that there's an eternal relationship already existing between things. It's not like that. It is actually the point of non-relation in some sense that you have to think about there. So on.
And Sam, I would love to hear what you think of my take on the story. And also I would say there is something like, it's very easy in the social order not to take seriously the -1, as we are describing, to kind of cover it up. And yet people still have to live with it, right? People still have to engage with and figure out what they're going to do with it. But it's interesting how kind of social orders can be created to conceal that in some ways.
So just a quick rundown of how I thought of the story, how I interpreted it was when they're in the circus, it was the spectator, as soon as because I thought it was interesting, the performer was specifically a woman, and then the spectator was specifically a man. And I interpreted it as soon as the spectator lusted after the woman and sought her for sexual desire, it didn't matter how hard she worked for her performance, because her beauty overrided everything that she had worked for. So it's not even the fault of the man, in the sense, it's just the way the circus is structured. It's almost like I gave the example in my video of being trapped in a music box, where it's just constantly, where the woman performer, she's singing a song and constantly going around and around, and it's like the spectator is captivated by this, and it's like, and he's crying at the end because it's like he wants to escape, but he doesn't know how to escape, or doesn't want to escape, because the structure is this way, and it's hard to articulate, and it's easier for me to write it down and say it, but that's basically what it was. It's this structure making it hard to escape from the circus and from this almost like prison of having to perform as the woman.
Oh no, I think that puts it very well, and it makes me think a few things. One, following Buber, it would seem that lust would hinder an IU experience. But what about desire? Is there a difference between, say, lust and desire? Would you even care to enter into an IU without desire? Well, that means you're playing with fire, because what if desire becomes lust, right? Is there a difference between attraction and desire? There's I find all of that very, very interesting, right? Because again, I don't, and Javier, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, I never from Buber get much of a reading on, the differences between attraction, desire, lust, and these different things, although clearly something like lust turns it to an I-it instead of an IU. And then before passing it on, and Bethany, great to see you, always great to see you. Everyone, Bethany is a very talented writer at Substack. I highly suggest it. It's always good to see Bethany. And one of the things that makes me think, Sam, that what you're describing is how it's almost like if it actually was possible in the social order to make people constantly perform like society actually does in the realm of the negative one, then you'd almost be able to stop society, because society would allow you to run down onto the stage and stop the performance, right? Because everyone would see that it was clearly torture. But precisely because the negative one is hidden as a zero, per se, if we keep using that language, then the society keeps going. And really society, following the circus as a symbol of society in that story, the circus has control on if the performance is done 24/7 or if it is broken up. And therefore it has control on if it allows it to be justified to step in and stop it. And so the protagonist, crying in the stands, doesn't have that power. It's like the system that does the capturing also has to create the conditions where stopping that capturing is justified. And so he doesn't have control. And and I think you've put it very well, where that is a kind of dilemma that very few modern writers were as well at capturing as was Kafka.
Well, if okay, I came up with a thought. If I completely misunderstood what we're talking about, please correct me. But I was thinking, like, in this example, it's a circus, right? And it's like the person, instead of becoming a person, becomes an it, like kind of like an object becomes an it. And this is like a very and this is in terms of desire, lust, etc. But this could also extrapolate to maybe to other aspects of life, because I think, like, for example, when you're in a corporation and they say like human resources, like the word human resources is like you're not a human, you're like another resource in itself. You stop being like a human and you're like an it again. So like in a sense, like that relation is not mediated by desire or lust, but it's also like it becomes the person, and it also in another context, but it and the first time I realized that is like human resources, I was like completely fascinated, because it's like, yeah, like, and even the way you think about it, you don't see them as persons, you see them as costs. I have to like let go of X amount of people because they cost me X months, or how can I pay them less, because you stop seeing them as people, you don't treat them as people, they're like cogs in a machine, they are like a resource. So yeah, the -1 is hidden in the 0 in like in maybe in other aspects. So I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how I think social media has become too, because it's like when people start putting out content and they create this persona for themselves, it's almost like we expect them to continue to do that for our entertainment. And we forget that there is actual human behind that screen.
So does that mean, Sam, and then I'll give it back to you, Amelia, there's a sense in which social media puts everyone in the circus almost?
and the funny thing is that normally we associate like the circus with something that's not precisely superficial, but at least like a nice facade, in the sense that you paint yourself in a good manner. In Instagram, you post only the pictures that you look the best, or that you're the happiest, like, right? So but I'm reminded of an episode of Black Mirror that's like, I'm going to spoil the episode, but it's basically they live in a society where everything's consumption. You work like you pedal like in a little like bicycle thing, and you get like points that you can spend on like toothpaste or whatever. And this person is like deeply depressed. He's so fed up with the system, and he tries to fight it, right? So he participates in this talent show, and he like in a crack in the system, he breaks a glass, he has a glass shard, and he goes into stage and he tries to kill himself, and he's like, don't you see this is happening? And everyone starts clapping like, this is the best entertainment, this is real and stuff. And they give him his own channel, his own thing, and now like you can go like at 3 o'clock and say like, oh, I'm gonna kill myself, and then like, okay, see you next week. So like even the critique is like absorbed by the system. Like even if what you display is real, it still becomes like a product, a -1. So it's just it seems very difficult to escape. I don't know what would be like. Yeah, I don't know.
No, just to build on this idea of the human resources, right? Not just corporations, but and also social media. You know, I have my note here. A lot of times, are these personalities, these social media personalities via your whatever platform. You never notice the big priority of regularity about it. You're told it produces content at a certain regular tempo, right? And actually, I got my social media parasocial relationships that I look forward to when the content I get that ding of content, get that hit, and I actually almost get sad or disappointed when they stop posting at the regular tempo. I know what's going on. It's basically a kind of parasocial, emotional body budget regulation. Like this, it's very much an I-it relationship. This person is not a person. It's basically a hit of my emotional subregulation of emotion. I mean, that's just basically we're turning people into memes, because people already communicate. Most people's social relationships with people is emoting with memes. I never done that, but I know friends who do that. They literally just send memes to each other. There is no actual communication. Like there's no self-author communication. It is only kind of co-opting memes to emote what they're feeling. It's kind of a hilarious point. This is the state. So that's already bad enough when it's just like static images or GIFs or whatever. But then when it's actual people in this social state that they become memeified, and they become this vehicle of self-emotional communication and regulation between people. At least with the memes sharing with friends, there's something directly social. When it's just a broadcast model, it's parasocial. There is no direct, that's not even a direct relationship in any sense. Anyways, that's why I just had to meditate on that point.
In this, I'm coming into this sort of decontextualized, so I don't know if this is like throwing some sort of wrench in there, but I do want to throw it in there about people's choices whether to take a pseudonym or not. And because it seems like if you're going into the arena of the internet and you're like the internet is a place separate from your real world place. And so like people, I don't know, I don't really have a fully formed thought. That's why I just wanted to like throw this into the conversation. But just, it seems like it's a much more, whereas having a pen name, publishing under a pen name, like in the 19th century or whatever, was usually used as a vehicle to, if you had some barrier to publishing, and so you needed a pen name to, you know, get what you wanted published or get the word out there. And now the decision whether to publish under a pseudonym has a lot to do with, or it seems to me that people might choose a pseudonym or choose to publish under a pseudonym because they want to present a very specific persona in this arena, this public arena of the internet. And they're sort of leaning, it almost seems like they're leaning into that meme complex, like they're trying to make themselves a meme, but also they're leaning into like becoming not, well, like they're depersonifying themselves, but in a weird way to like push more of what their true persona is maybe, or like one facet of a persona is. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there.
Like, so I've been reading Heidegger, and I think Heidegger would be interesting push in here, especially when we talk about the internet and memeing. I think right now, if we were to put like a Heideggerian like push on this, the they self is the memeing, is the emojis. It is the domination of everything on the internet, of what people call themselves. I'm pretty sure Heidegger would say something like nobody is themselves because you are no one, because you're just being everybody else. I think even Bethany's point on the persona or the pseudonym, that might also be like, oh, I'm just trying to be someone, but again, that's just following into the trap of being like everybody else. You can see it's very apparent that there is this constant individuality that is pushed out, like be yourself, but even the pursuit of that is actually being like everybody else, right? So you fall into that trap of the they self, right? And I think Heidegger would be sort of laughing in his grave right now about the internet, right? You're just reducing yourself to probably, you're caught in the gestel or gestel, whatever. Now, my comment to Chetan, I wanted to say is my void is not a zero. My void is not a zero, Chetan. Basically, what I've been trying to think is, how does the subject become possible? How do we give -1 and 0? To me, that is the void. Void is what gives -1 and 0. The other thing that I've been thinking about with Heidegger when we talk about the -1 is in Being in Time, Heidegger says this really interesting thing about Dasein gives spatiality. I've been thinking that actually as subjects, we give the -1. We give a -1 to other people and things, which can be disguised as a 0. And that's just kind of like my comments on that right now. And then I guess like if you want to understand like my void a little bit further, the theological void that I've been talking about, well, I've been trying to separate the two, but if you want to understand like theologically, void to me is God's withdrawal. That's how I look at it.
At first, I was going to ask, like, okay, if you are in the circus, if you're like in this like exposed, how do we escape? But then just Javier said like, oh, there's no escaping, so that's nice. So in a way, so then my question would be then like, then what would be the best choice for ourselves? Because if we participate, sometimes we're miserable, but if we try to escape, we end up like we end up in the same place. So what, like it's actually like a question that, like any of you see, like, okay, so what can we actually do that's like an effective way of like, maybe if we cannot escape the system, what's like the most well, the best is very ambiguous, but what's the best way to live in it, right? Because maybe it is like maybe it is the best way of just like posting your best pictures on Instagram. Maybe that's the best experience you can have in the circus, or maybe, or yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to yeah, it's basically a question because I'm trying to think what could be the best experience if you are forced to be in that circus, in that state, right?
Anybody wants to answer the question? Yeah, okay. I remember, this question of memes actually. I remember when I was young and even now, what we used to do was we used to go for morning walks, and I used to go for a run in the morning. So every day you would have certain people who come in the morning, and you would actually exchange pleasantries with them in the form of memes at times, and if you think about it, this kind of a culture in which subjectivities were actually molded exists for a long time. It's not that it only came with the internet. I think we need to be much more precise about what happened with the internet as different than what is happening in your, everyday life. And I think there's a very good book called Speed and Politics. I don't remember the name of the person, but if you search for it, you'll get it. I think one of the things that we need to start thinking about when we think about social media is the question of speed. Something we do not realize that when something speed becomes, so for example, if you have a phone and I can store all kinds of numbers into this. Today, I don't need to remember any numbers in my own head. Everything is there on the, so when the speed becomes beyond a certain point, it can substitute the subject itself. The speed itself has a quality of that shape taking place. That once you increase the speed beyond a point, it can substitute for yourself. And how do we, and I think we can come back to Sam's question there, that how do we put ourselves in this story then, where we need to slow things down for ourselves in some ways. There is that real challenge in front of us. Even the best things, when they happen at a certain speed, you will realize that your own, I can use Bernard Stiegler's language here, the distinction between secondary attention and tertiary attention. That you can stop retaining things yourself, and you can outsource your own subjective capacity to something else. Just in that problem of the speed. And it may not always be bad. It may sometimes be needed also. Sometimes it can aid you, in doing new things and keeping only those things in your head that you want to keep. But it can also erode you from inside. It can also, capture you from within, which you'll not realize. And how do we think through that kind of the question, and what kind of effects it has on the point of decision, politics, and other spheres of our lives, culture, society, the social milieu, and so on and so forth.
I really loved how Chetan said slowing down, and to build on Emilio's question of how do we even get out of the circus, it makes me think of like, say, a political figure being a spectator, and then like the working class person being the performer, because that's the person who's like actually doing the work in the real for like the country. And I wonder if getting out of it is like the spectator coming down to the performer and then also performing with the performer. So it's like saying, it's like a political figure can't understand a working class member and can't say, well, this is what's best for them if they have not done those things themselves that the working class member has done. So I wonder if like that has something to do with maybe kind of getting out of the circus and changing the structure a little bit. I don't know how we would go about that, but that's just an idea. So.
No, all outstanding. And first off, Emilio, the first 2 seasons of Black Mirror is like true art genius. And then like the first 5 of season 3, and then I stopped watching. But that one episode I've never forgotten. One of the reasons I think Kafka keeps coming up is because I think very often in his work, he is exploring ways to escape Deleuzian capture. For example, we have in The Hunger Artist, the notion of becoming the panther, as I talked about with Pei. That's a way to escape. At the end of the trial, he says, like a dog, as if, if you could be a dog and escape human, the way that consciousness structures reality toward you, you would not pull yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into the trial. Rather one believes Kafka comes up with an answer or not. He was one of the particularly brilliant brilliant writers at articulating the problem and showing it, and showing things like Sam has articulated so well. Certain emotional states that cannot be captured in single words. So Kafka is quite useful here. I think what you're describing, Sam, is some of the efforts of the new sincerity put forth by David Foster Wallace. Like, we cannot necessarily escape a performative structure, but we can be generally sincere in the participate in it in a manner of which has a glimmer of something shine through. I am trying to get more careful in using the term meta-modernity. I've been talking with Mr. Greg Dember, and I have not used it correctly, but I understand an effort of meta-modernity is in fact a oscillation as a key term between postmodern irony, efforts of modernity, and in that oscillation have some sort of breakthrough, some sort of glimmer of something more that suggests a kind of exit. Now, of course, Sartre comes in and says no exit, but what can we do from that? I think Javier has put in the, and Bethany, I'm gonna have to check out that book. That title is amazing looking. I'm gonna have to check that out. Javier has suggested something that Mr. Wynn has said in a number of talks of being who we already are, which is an interesting concept. I've been thinking a lot about, and I'll bring this up because Dr. Cadell, we were speaking the other day on the science of logic and presenting a new epistemology that many post-Hegelian thinkers don't really follow that very well. They tend to be either a Heideggerian response to our current situation or a Deleuzian response. Heidegger, I would say, is a solution of a certain way of holding being, which I like to call suchness, as I brought up with Trey, where Deleuze is going to be essential difference in escaping capture, right? Like, not being intelligible in different things. What I am convinced of, and I think that Kafka shows, is that as long as you're operating, and I'm going to use some terms, and forgive me if it doesn't make sense, Kafka is showing that as long as you're operating according to AA logic, you cannot escape capture. You're either going to end up in the trial, you're going to end up trying to escape something and not, you're going to be part of a resistance that is absorbed into the problem, just like Emilio was saying. You're always going to end up, or I really like this idea, Bethany, on the idea of the difference between the pseudonym and the pen name and the pseudonym. It's almost like what we're trying to do online is create all entirely different realities that versus just sort of using a pen name to get into the system because we couldn't before because of some lack of connections or so on and so forth. It makes me think of how Zizek has that part where he says, people think people play video games to escape, but actually in the video game, it's their true self, because that's who they would be if they weren't thrust into the determinations of reality, where they're given certain gens and genes. So it's a notion that your true self comes out in the video game. It's almost like what's happening online is people are using pseudonyms or the online to create the true world that they would be if they weren't, born in a certain place with certain genetics. But with the concept that's arising here that I find really interesting, it's almost like a Deleuzian they. If we take Heidegger's Das the they, it's almost like a kind of blob of essentially different individuals that make up a they, a new kind of they. And it's not an escape. It's actually falling into what exactly Emilio was saying. It seems to be a solution, but it's actually not. It's still part of the same problem. Maybe if I remember Hahn's swarm, can that be associated with the swarm where Hahn makes the difference between the crowd and the swarm? I can't remember. It's dangerous to bring up things I'm not sure about. And so, for me, and then I'll pass it on, we've all, Chatan and the Hegel, we've talked, there's a need for a new epistemology that I like to think of in terms of the movement of self-consciousness to reason, the becoming other, which if we follow Mr. Wynn, you already are other. You just have to come to the place where you realize you are other, which the last thing I'll say would then be a movement that follows a different way of logic and thinking, and all epistemologies have ontological consequences, that I think would be a kind of solution so you don't end up at the end of your revolution just on stage with a piece of glass and then you get absorbed into the system, or you're a Deleuzian they that is actually powerless to make a difference. There has to be a new onto-epistemology that I think can be suggested by taking seriously the becoming other. And that would lead me into a subject I've been thinking about all week, and then I'll pass it on. I think there actually was, in the same way there was a counter-enlightenment movement, I'm increasingly convinced there was a counter-modernism movement that was actually missed, that did take seriously new kinds of logic, like a like a Plonier, a Blondel, a Korobaska, and some other thinkers that I think were completely forgotten. It's not post-modernity. It's a counter-modernity movement that actually might be a solution to a lot of the problems that we are describing, but that would require another book, another 2 hours or something.
What is that? What is metamotivational theory?
Javier said it is your responsibility now. You put it in the chat. You put it in the
Okay,
chat. It's your responsibility.
okay. So Daniel and I have been talking. I have been reading Maslow, and he has been thinking intrinsic motivation. And reading Maslow helps me think development. How do we think development? So in correspondence with thinking intrinsic motivation and development, basically, I'm tying this in as meta-motivational theory. The problem is, and Daniel, we went on a very long rant the other night, like a couple of nights ago. It's my fault, apparently, because my cat wasn't there. That the problem is that every time we talk about, I, you, or, I, other, we're not talking about how do you sustain that thing that we're talking about. And that's the problem that we're getting at with when we talk about I, you, like how do we sustain that actual state? What keeps a person progressing towards that state? Maslow, of course, Maslow, and in my opinion, presents a very interesting theory that is also very Nietzschean, right? We need more danger, right? Safety and needs are kind of like what keep us in a from becoming. It kind of keeps us from becoming. So the problem is, how do we develop something that is going to push a subject out of its own comforts to become what they already are? In some sense, actually, Maslow would say your needs and your safety is actually what prevents you from becoming what you are. So that is actually the way I'm reading Maslow right now. And Daniel can comment because now it's his it's on him now.
Yeah, so meta-motivational theory, because you actually can't publish anything without the word meta in it anymore. So, a theory of the difference between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. I think intrinsic motivation could be aligned with, the good of Deleuze, say the line of flight, or the notion of being one's own mover and what they do, as opposed to getting their source of motivation outside of themselves. And very often, because if you're going to talk about replacing, say, being with becoming, or putting more of an emphasis on becoming, well, that is going to require there's two ways. There can be becoming that is extrinsically motivated, which then will just play into the system, or it could be coming of which is intrinsically motivation, of which has some sort of drive that is internal. So this is what's interesting. When we talk about are-ness, what you already are, it would seem to be the case, and this is kind of an interesting question. It would seem to be the case that humans are beings that have the possibility of action and self-movement. They have the ability to act and to motivate themselves. There is something there. But then the issue is we also have the ability to be Zizekian self-relating negativities, where we try to relate to ourselves as selves of which we are not, right? And as a result, we get very bad at our R-ness, our intrinsic motivation, because we're defining ourselves, say, by the social order, or being a performer in the circus, or trying to, figure out if we're innocent from a trial. As a result, we continually outsource our motivation to things that we are not. And then when those things that we are not cease to provide that motivation, we fall into boredom, sadness, and a lot of the other things that define modernity today, right? So when we find that problem, one of the ways we can solve that problem, though, is by finding a new extrinsic motivation. Say we're going to stop the system that made people ride bicycles and collect points. So we're going to stop that, right? But the problem is, we get to the top, since we don't have a robust intrinsic motivation for what we're doing, we're easily captured by the system once it presents us our own show and lets us do what we want to do, right? We're not able to sustain the revolution, if you will, right? Because we're still operating according to an extrinsic motivation, and it's only a matter of time before the system basically outsmarts us and provides an alternative extrinsic motivation via algorithms or all these lovely things that I hear are taking over the world these days. Would have been nice if it was Skynet, because it's so much more obvious when it's these giant robots with red eyes, that will then result in a new form of capture. So there seems to be something about intrinsic motivation. But here's the other thing. Once you start talking about intrinsic motivation, that does bring with it a new onto-epistemology or a new epistemology, because what kind of being are you, of which seems to have some sort of source of action, of which is not readily computed into pure physical terms or immediacy, that you are nevertheless identifiable with somehow? Now, I would have to unpack everything I'm saying there. I understand that. And I can get, and if, I have a bunch of really weird papers if you want. But there's this kind of idea that it brings with it a new onto epistemology. And then the question would be, what are the implications of that? And this is what I'm increasingly aligning with what I'm calling, and I don't know if I'll keep this phrase, but something like a counter-modernism in philosophy that I think has been overlooked, that I think might provide a way to escape this situation where at the end of the day, we just get our own show threatening to commit suicide with a blade of glass, because that doesn't seem like a very successful revolution.
Just sort of a brief sort of plug-in in that sense that, when we're thinking of this binary of extrinsic and intrinsic motivations, what we are at least sort of not explicitly saying in some sense, and there's a minor disagreement here, and maybe it's there, it's not, you can tell me in that sense. But when we think about the unconscious, or we think about desire is always implicated in the other. So there is no authentic intrinsic motivation possible in that sense. In the first place, you cannot have an authentic intrinsic desire which is completely devoid of the other. That subjectivity is not possible. This becomes a crucial problem if you take this into light, because a lot of times when we start thinking about intrinsic motivation, we start thinking it as separate from extrinsic motivation. Okay, that is not what I want. This is what I want, and usually that is a point of catastrophe for us in some senses, because the only way to build a system internally is to find relationship with the other, with the outside, with the external points. And that is where the problem of desire becomes much more difficult to think through, because there we need to start struggling with realizing that our internal motivations are actually dependent upon the outside, even if we can't immediately start satisfying the other in that sense, which would come down to a question of what we start thinking in the sense of dead drive in Freud, or we can start thinking in terms of as I said, secondary attentions, or in what way the subject becomes able to develop itself. There's one more point I think there, which something's slipping from my head. Sometimes happens, you're talking and you start forgetting what you're saying. But I'll just stop here. If I remember it, I'll just get back to you and I'll raise my hand again. Yeah.
One thing that jumped out of the first thing that you were saying is that you said that there cannot be like intrinsic motivation, because like you cannot exist from the other, and I think that's right. But this reminds me of the thing of Daniel said the other day, like distinction and I forget the other word, but there was like this difference, and I think that in a way, like, for example, you can only desire something that exists, for example. So that's like, in a way, that desire cannot exist without an external thing. But let's say that if we make a different definition of intrinsic motivation, would be that, of course, like there are things in the world to desire, to use desire as an example, and from within you, because of psychological process or whatever, you desire it. That's like intrinsic motivation, instead of saying like, that would be like the definition of, for you, like, of course you are mediated and of course you are influenced and of course like that, but like say that it's more, it's on the specification, right? It's more of an internal thing than an external thing. Because if, for example, I had one friend that said like, oh my God, this movie is so cool, this is the best movie ever, and I copy that desire. In a sense, we could say that that's less intrinsic, right? If we try to specify it in a sense. So I think that's I think it's a useful distinction, even though it might, like, in the most absolute terms, maybe it seems like a little bit paradoxical, but I think it's a useful distinction. And just some things that you said, Daniel, in the last bit is, for example, when you were saying all these things, I remember the book Incomplete Nature. I've not yet read it. I'm still at the beginning, but I will try to explain the premise. Is that, okay, imagine, like, if you think about it, everything is atoms, right? Everything is atoms, stars, planets, humans, everything is atoms. So, like, in science, there's this idea, how do, like, living beings exist, and how does like awareness and consciousness exist. And like for the longest time, like physics and science has had a view of the world that's like that doesn't have us in it. Like we can explain how the movements work, but like we don't understand humans as a creation force that has shaped the whole planet, right? So like in a way, science describes the world, the universe perfectly, but without us inside. So that's like a weird distinction that the author explicitly says, that if our description of how the world works doesn't include us, then we're left like we're aliens in our own universe in a way. So it's just, I find that really poetic in sense. And he says that that, for example, I'm sure, Daniel, that you will love the book, because he explicitly says that what makes us human is the incompleteness of our things. That he says that, for example, emergent phenomena are like, usually the way I've always heard about it is that emergent phenomena are more than the sum of the things, right? So like so that's an emergent phenomena. It's the result is more than the sum of the things. But this book says it's the contrary. It's the emergent phenomena is the result of less than the sum of the things. So for example, he says like in a motor in a car, like you have like pistons, right? So like the pistons can only go like a specific certain way, like up and down. If they go like a little bit sideways, like the motor stops moving. So in a way, the emergent phenomena that is a motor in a car, it's only possible because of the absence of possibility of the individual parts, kind of. Like I can only be a human because my human cells only do like a specific type of thing. If they like did some other thing, I would die. So that's kind of the thing that the books, at least I get from like the very beginning. So I find this fascinating and useful for the talk, because and it fits into the intrinsic motivation. That's in a way it situates us as this origin of causes, that of course like we are not removed from everything that happens, like of course, but in a way this explanation does grant us the place that we are the origin of stuff, right? Like as humans, we have terraformed the planet. So in a way, there's something there, like we are the originators of action, of movement, of changes, and like and not only the result of like all these changes, there's something there that we can be like the movers and moved in like specific ways in specific scenarios. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
That the problem that I have with the distinction actually is that not in some senses this opposition and this distinction is interesting in many ways, but putting these things as opposites can actually completely take away all the motivation from us, because because motivation itself, as I said, is dependent upon its outside in such a manner that when you start searching for, oh, these motivations are external, now I need to search for some authentic internal motivation, that can completely erode all motivation from within you as a subject. In fact, if you start thinking about the problem of this intrinsic, extending the problem of instrumentality, actually, in Freud, it's a question of immediate satisfaction versus long-term satisfaction. How do we orient ourselves towards a long-term satisfaction in some sense, rather than wanting that pleasure immediately? That's the challenge. And for ego, pleasure principle works in the manner that that doesn't happen. But the problem with instrumentality is that instrumentality is a very, very important thing in the lives of human beings. In fact, a lot of things we can't do for survival if we are not instrumental. The challenge becomes that at what point everything becomes instrumental. We don't have any space for anything else. Everything becomes a means to end category for us. How does that collapse take place? That's the challenge with instrumental values and thinking in something. The problem is not that we shouldn't have any instrumental values. We of course should. We always will have, depending on what we're surviving and so on and so forth. The challenge becomes, how do we create a space where we are not completely off instrumentality itself? We may be in it, but we do not become off it. And at what point where we can engage with means for the sake of means itself? And we can expect a satisfaction to happen not from its immediate ends, but from its certain long-term ends that we can't predict immediately. That is where danger and so on and so forth, And how do we think through? And that is where I think we can reorient the force from outside into inside out. And that is what intrinsic, I think, would actually mean. That when the force is not from the outside in, but it's working from,
No, outstanding. A few things. So for me, you have impulsiveness, like impulsive motivation, extrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation. You have kind of a Humean journey. Like all children tend to be intrinsically motivated, right? Which one tends to be evidence that it's good. The problem is they're intrinsically motivated to eat candy all day, right? Or to be impulsive or not to control. So you actually have to go through a socialization process, which can be extrinsically based, in order to channel and to direct that. Likewise, if you have a society of no givens, all releases, to use that language from Belonging Again, Philip Reef, and so on and so forth, then it's overwhelmed. It has no filtration, mediating system of the real, and it gets psychologically overwhelmed. There has to be a stageful development. Intrinsic motivation before there's becoming other tends to be very problematic, because in the same way, like if we're thinking Hegel, to use that language of becoming other, there's this interesting part where he's starting off the philosophy of the right, where he talks about we come into being facing determinism, but determinations and necessity, but feeling like we should not. So so how do we get free then, right? Because we're faced with things that we are not free. Well, we have to come to want the things that are determined. We have to come to identify with determination and want them, and then you cease to feel like you are not free, right? So there's a certain level where one has to become other and integrate with other, and then engage intrinsic motivation in terms of that otherness in realms of reason, not just self-consciousness. So there has to be a process. For me, this is the logic of AB. That there is a philosophical developmentism as opposed to an A is A. It's either extrinsic motivation or is intrinsically motivation, right? It has to be through a developmental process. Philosophy has not had a logic of developmentalism. I was talking with Javier about this the other day. It's always been who's the right thinker? What state can you enter into that's right with the right philosopher? Not thinking in terms of stages, right? Like, so for David Hume, which I always go to, if you stay in common life, and you don't engage in the philosophical journey, then you're prone to the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, the kind of thoughtlessness where you're just going to kind of suck up the zeitgeist of the community you live in and not really think for yourself. But if you go on the philosophical journey, say to the ivory tower, and you learn how to think, but then you get a spirit of resentment against the common life because that's just the working class or blue collar people and I don't need them, then you engage in a kind of totalitarianism or violence, right? You have to return kind of with the RE in parentheses to allude to Hegel to the common life. And then you are using philosophy in service of the lived, right? He wants to bring them together. Now, by returning to common life, he is not saying to passively accept common life, but it's more like not seeing yourself as better than, or seeing there to be a certain tactile dimension, if I want to use Planier's language, to the common life that you cannot gain unless you're embedded in it. So likewise, intrinsic motivation that does not go through the process of encountering the external world and learning about other people and seeing internal values will be an intrinsic motivation that tends to be selfish, right? That tends to be egotistical. The other thing I was saying to Javier, and then I'll pass it off to Javier, is that so I was saying in that conversation that you can have ego isness, or let me just use the it language. So you have I, it with Buber, right? So I'd say ego it, then you could say I, it, I suchness, I you, and then I / you. The issue is if you go from ego to suchness, which would be go to Heidegger without going through Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the development of the ego to the I, well, then the suchness is not something you can handle without having it reflect on your ego, and then you become pathological. You have to develop into a secure identity before you can really hold things in their suchness like Heidegger would want you to. But here's the problem. If you learn suchness, but then don't learn to apply that to other people as yous that have value, well, then you're not actually, you can start to treat other people as a problem and getting in the way of your experiences of suchness. And then you can get a political project out of Heidegger that is quite problematic if it doesn't transition into an IU. So there's a developmentalism that I think philosophy has been missing for a very long time. We talk about there was an idea that you go from first grade to 12, right? General education, there's physical development, but we really have not thought about philosophical development. And for me, that's where you get to an AB, and you have to see, like you're saying, intrinsic motivation as something that is earned or worked through or worked with in concert with an external world. Otherwise, it just becomes exercising an egotism. But of course, that would require constant active thinking, because that means you're then always vulnerable to capture because you are in fact engaging with the external world, right? There is no safety. If we're going to, you always must be at risk of ending up in the circus. You must always be and you're going to live in the circus, but will you be part of the circus? Will it like absorb you, right? You're always going to be at risk of ending up at the end of Black Mirror, having a piece of glass and getting your show. You're always at risk of that, but you don't have to do that, even if you always must risk. So basically what we're saying is that to be alive is to be in danger, but just because you're in danger doesn't mean you have to die or be effaced in a very bad way. There are alternatives if one has the right equipment.
Wonderfully put, Daniel. No, but Chetan, I really like what you're pointing out with the dichotomy of intrinsic and intrinsic motivation. I think I rather look at it as like depends on which way we turn. And the other thing is, I want to complexify it just a little bit more with Heidegger and say, look, what is the mood for development that discloses the motivation? I'm not sure, like, I haven't really thought that, but that was just something that came to my mind. I'm not sure if there's a mood that discloses something for the motivation itself, but it does make me think about it because Heidegger does talk about how we're always in a mood, and this mood discloses something. The other thing is bringing back to Maslow, and I think Chetan brought it up in a roundabout way, is how do we talk about long-term enjoyment? And Maslow says something very interesting about self-actualizing people. Self-actualizing people actually don't have a goal or an end, which is very interesting. Self-actualizing people enjoy growth for the sake of growth itself. So you could say actually the long-term enjoyment is the becoming itself. They have realized through the journey that it is the becoming itself that is the pure enjoyment. Or as Rumi had said in a poem before, thankfully that Michelle shared to me a while ago, it is the longing of the longing that is what sustains us, the longing of the longing. And you could actually say this is why satisfaction fails, because it's supposed to fail. It is the longing of the longing. It is the Zeno's paradox. It is what sustains the desire in the first place.
Yeah, this question of one of the interesting things actually is that how do you sustain desires where you do not have immediate satisfaction possible, where you do not already have a rule through which you can get an end. That's the real challenge in some senses. That how do you sustain desire in the face of uncertainty? And it's we may think about it, but most of the times even our highest desires are actually sustained through certain rules in our head through which we think our end can be achieved. I think Rumi said it somewhere that how do you live in this world but not be of this world? In that sense, how do you find an orientation towards the outside? As Heidegger has an interesting problem there. That how do we start thinking about that kind of an orientation, where the desires can be sustained, the tension can be held, without you having the rule through which an end can be achieved, and in that zone of uncertainty. And that's, I think, Yanil.
For me, intrinsic motivation is primarily a concept after that Humean journey of sustaining, right? Of how to sustain a longing or a kind of movement, a kind of going. Intrinsic motivation is not merely saying, I want ice cream and no one around me told me ice cream, therefore it's intrinsic motivation because I came up with the idea, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I got this really yellow shirt, it makes me think of banana ice cream. So that would be great right now. But there's something about sustaining. And I think I mentioned this with Javier and Trey before. Theology has kind of stressed a notion of God as sustaining being, as kind of the ground of being, but philosophy has not had so much a doctrine of sustaining or thinking in terms of sustaining. Now, I haven't read every philosopher, and I'm not saying I know that's necessarily the case. But when we start thinking about what is the philosophical developmentalism that needs to go through so one can sustain a longing, and therefore continue a sort of intrinsic motivation, a self-motivation that is an egotism, a becoming other motivation. Let me see how many terms I can do. That becomes really, really important. To me, I am of the impression of this counter modernism that I'm describing, that there were a number of thinkers who were aware of that. Blondel's Action really comes to mind. He talks about, and this is really funny, and it is kind of hilarious when he points it out. He said, it's pretty funny, but we stop caring to think about something as soon as we get the certainty that we thought to obtain. The moment I am certain of something, I don't care to think about it anymore. And yet we think thinking is in the business of certainty. That's weird. And his point is, following modern logic, if you develop thinking around modern logic as a goal for certainty, then there's a kind of irony drive, maybe a death drive, there's a kind of effacement that thinking is engaged in. So what Blondel is suggesting is that thinking needs to somehow exist in service or dialectic with action. And action is compelled by longing and uncertainty and a notion of mystery. And the way I sum this up, and then I'll pass it on, Michelle and I recently had a talk on the difference between unknown and unknowability. And a lot of modern philosophy is in the business of unknowability, where we determine what is unknowable. Oh, it's across the noumenon. Oh, it's subjective. Oh, it's not something that has any substance to know. So a lot of unknowability, when really we need to return to a philosophy of the unknown, which is risky because it could be Lovecraft or it could be a conspiracy or something like that. But if I were to say to you, hey, that mountain over there is unknowable, you might go, oh, okay, shrug and go back to eating your hot dog. But if I say to you that mountain over there is unknown, ooh, it's unknown? Maybe there's an adventure to be had, right? If thinking is in the business of realizing the unknown and figuring out the proper action and posture toward the unknown, then we might be able to get out of this plague of boredom or the meaning crisis that people keep talking about. But as long as philosophy is primarily a philosophy of unknowability, well, that's a form of certainty, right? We can't know, and you're certain that unknowability is there, so who cares anymore? And therefore, there's a certain weight that comes to life that becomes quite dismal. But you see, then the question, though, is what is an action based on the unknown? And how is that different from simply positing an unknown that you can use to control other people? So there are a lot of distinctions that would have to go from there. But AA epistemology tends to have led itself in the direction of unknowability, which has led to a lack of motivation and kind of a death of philosophy, as opposed to AB epistemology, and I know I'm using terminology there, forgive me. AB epistemology can lead to a philosophy of the unknown, which has a motivational principle behind it.
I just want to say that for me, all these these talks are really wonderful, but I think that what you said, Daniel, the stuck with me is that, for example, unknown versus unknowability is that it's there's I'm cautious of using the term useful or something, but for me, when philosophy is supposed to be useful and actually have an impact on daily life, and if people debate on knowability, it makes maybe an interesting, engaging intellectual conversation, but the usefulness of it gets lost. If I speak with most of my friends and I talk about philosophy, they will say that's people in chair thinking and smoking a pipe. That's not useful in real life. So there's this disconnect, and just just hearing stated in words that I hadn't thought about before. I found it really beautiful in English. Just focus on the unknowns, because that's the usefulness part. What Bethany said, just unknowability is stasis, but overall, and unknown, prone to action, adventure, and I just find that really beautiful. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Emily. And I should note, I'm not saying that there's no place at all for determining unknowability, or even determining that you shouldn't try to know, because you might get pulled into some sort of Thomas Pynchon novel or a Kafka story. So there's a place for unknowability. But if that's all you do, then you have a deconstructive element, but not a constructive element. You have the making the clearing in Heidegger, but not building anything in the clearing. So unknowability ultimately has to be in service of, if we're speaking here an unknown, which could be, if you say plan to build an art center, right now it is unknown because it has not been built into concretion by which it can be known concretely, right? I don't mean unknown merely in terms of, say, Lovecraft or great mysteries or whatever. There's a kind of a future drive to it. But the problem is modern philosophy, this is how I would say it. I'm of the impression that modern philosophy, if we go to Fitch and kind of go from there, has led to an emphasis on unknowability, where there may have been a counter-modernism that would give, based on that, I think follows the science of logic as I understand it, but I'm not an expert. I hope to get better. That provides an avenue for the resources of the unknown, of which that can go into tactile dimensions, that can go into action and lead to a different alternative.
I really appreciate the conversation. I've been chewing here and meditating on what's been saying here. You know, I think I'm going to more share what I'm just going to chew on after this session. I did the same thing after the last week's recording as well. Oh, I love you too, Daniel. I think this idea, first part I noted way back when Emilio was asking, I think actually the ultimate purpose of philosophy, a lot of cases, is what is the good life and how ought one live it? If there's any touch point between all the disciplines of philosophy, it's ethics. Ultimately, in the end, everything hits there at the end. So really, in my opinion, the question is, how do we be of the world, not in the world? Which is ultimately a question of what's the act of the intellect really to think through is what's the principles we ought to live, and principles that have limit, right? Because principle is a kind of definition that is just one to declaring of what to stop as opposed to what to accelerate, what to push forward, which ultimately leads to the question, is the activity of the intellect to achieve certainty or is it to achieve peace? It is a very big difference. For example, there's a lot of things in life, like I was on a jury for a murder trial, and I believed it was very skewed how the deliberations were occurring. And I did everything in my power to try to make the trial a fair trial by the jurist. Eventually, I moved by nature of the definitions of the laws presented that we had to decide on, I sided with the majority. But I made an absolute hell of the case for a week, to the point where several jury members later, after everything was decided, came to me and asked, are you okay? You were the most adamant to give this man a due hearing. Are you okay with what occurred? Even though you joined the majority in the end. My answer was, yes, I'm at peace. I did what I believe was the right thing to do, to give this man a fair hearing and listen through the case. Was it certainty? Actually, I was very satisfied in the room that everyone agreed. No, we don't know. We actually don't have certainty what the decision is. We have to make the best call. In a weird way, that actually I was at peace of that. And that's the best we can do in a court system in that case. So that is not a declaring of certainty. We don't use that decision-making policy in the courts. It's, in a way, a kind of the best judgment we can make at the time. So kind of peace. These are just things me and meditating on. On last note, for the religious members in the group maybe watching, you know, I'm thinking of the name of the law, which is the compeller, right? Not in a sense of demanding a determinants onto us that we have to act a certain way and be a certain way, but it's the kind of Augustinian, my Lord, I won't be in peace until I'm in the heart of you, my Lord. So I'm thinking very much in that sense of principles of understanding. Anyways, a little scattered, I apologize, but this is just things I'm chewing on from everyone's conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It makes me think very quickly. I had a conversation with Hybrid, who I adore, and talking about Blondel, there's this notion that we, philosophy would have us ask, instead of asking every single day, what am I going to do today? With a kind of like, what am I going to do? It's almost like you need to ask, what is the action that I'm going to bring into the world? What is the action I'm going to bring in the world, which has a certain weight, which then gets into ethics, which then gets into what is going to be created, as opposed to what's kind of happened is the question of what am I going to do today, almost has a kind of boredom. Well, maybe I'll go to, you know, McDonald's or something like that. We need to have a certain depth added back to the question of action, which hopefully, like you say, I think philosophy can provide, but gets into questions of ethics and the good and so on and so forth. So Javier, get your cat. Hurry up and get your cat, Javier.
I don't know where he is right now.
Sorry, you're the owner. You're supposed to love that cat. What do you mean you don't know where it's at?
I let him do his thing. You know, I'm not a possessive lover.
Oh, intrinsic motivation. Well, that's intrinsic motivation before reason. Okay, you're just letting it act on impulse. For all you know, it's in a game show right now with a piece of glass. You don't even know. You don't even know. It's fine.
But yeah, it's funny. Like Thomas said, like, you know, all of philosophy is you know, the good, beautiful life. I had another take, but I would add on to it for Thomas. For me, like all of philosophy is a preparation to do exactly nothing. Is to capitalize on that whole becoming what you already are.
You mean what you're doing with your cat right now? Leaving it alone? Okay, yeah, doing nothing, letting him get, that's fine.
Which it would be, in my opinion, the good life, the beautiful life. There is this old Hasidic tale that I really love that actually was Thomas Merton that shares it. about how the irony of Adam and Eve is actually that they were already good, but they wanted to know that they were doing good or evil. That was like the whole like irony. And that's why I really love like the whole becoming what you already are, because it really pinpoints that irony. But at the same time, the becoming what you already are already talks about the phenomenological journey, which is why I really love, in my opinion, I think you could read The Alchemist and kind of like understand Hegel. Like if you read The Alchemist, I think you'll understand Hegel in some ways, because the whole point is like, oh, wait a second, I left to go find something and then I come back and that's where it is. You know, but the other thing I wanted to comment on was boredom. I actually think boredom is actually the very point of asking, where it sort of is asking for transcendence, but we always turn away and we go towards safety or whatever. You could actually say like boredom is actually mundane danger. That's how I'm going to call it, mundane danger. Like, oh no, I'm bored. Oh no,
That
I'm
makes
so
me think
bored.
about like Bukakov will say like hell is the encounter of a God like you hate. Like he makes the point where he's kind of saying like, you know, a lot of people in Christian theology will think that, you know, God shows up and then 3 days later there's a judgment, when really it's the encounter of God itself that is the judgment, because if you hate God, then the infinity kind of overwhelms you. So Bukakov talks about that. Makes me think there what you're saying, that boredom is like encountering a paradise you don't care about, in the same way that hell is an encounter of a God you hate. So there's a certain sort of, but that would speak to the inner state or whatever being paramount, right? I mean, one of the great revelations, if you know, if you're in a relatively middle class or whatever life, is precisely that although material well-being is important, you know, you don't want to not have water or live in a war zone or different things. There's another level of the philosophical, the development of the person that gets into inner things, and you have to do all of them, and it becomes a very complex undertaking.
Oh man, I came, so I might as well say something. I've been kind of half distracted here, but this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. And almost everything I've thought to say, someone else has already said it. So I just was pleased to let it keep on going. I'm always like probably 3 or 4 abstraction levels too high to remain in any one place. And we've been over so much territory here. It's been fascinating. Like I see shades of like metaphysics and politics and ethics and economics and all of this stuff, and I'm trying to hold each of it and to kind of reduce an essence of what's occurring here, besides just lovely people talking lovely thoughts to each other. But there's really this question of self that I'm very quite interested in terms of like, let's call it ironically applied metaphysics, the creation of the self, like how it is we're actually going about this and what that move is, because we started in mathematics. What that move is between recognizing linear kind of pre-existing motivational states, right? So the directionality is predetermined. I can move forwards or backwards. And so I have assigned integer value, right? Versus, and this is beautiful, brought up, I think, by Thomas initially, the imaginary number, which is in fact a rotational element, right? So you're actually moving from that linear value into a plane value. You're extending into a new dimension. Now that move right there, that's the thing. And so what I see is the creation of the self is this, when you're talking about intrinsic and extrinsic states, and the fact that you can't really, since we're talking about dynamical evolving systems, you can't really say one is either or, because it's continually changing, right? So everything which is intrinsic to myself is developed from some prior state, which was fundamentally a relationship between the intrinsic and extrinsic. And there was some motion between the two. There's something about recognizing the, let's say the finitude. So this is the relationship between the bounded finitude of self and the intrinsic and how we conceive of it, and the unbounded infinitude, right, which is outside the self. Because if I'm fighting with you over quantity, right, if I'm fighting with you over a spot on the number line, I can choose 2 different directions. And this is to bring in something Cadell put here, this return to the void. So I can reduce my need for that linear resource and go back towards void. Or, and this is kind of a more Western Eastern split, right? I can do the innovative approach, which is fundamentally move in a diagonal direction, right? It's enter into a fundamentally new space. And that question of which do I do is present simultaneously within us. I think we have fundamentally specialized resources within this intrinsic being that allow us to negotiate those two different strategical orientations. So beautiful, all of you. There's such a lovely demonstration of, well, let's call it the crux of the matter, right? Where the horizontal and the vertical meet between past motivational states and the present landscape of opportunity.
It's beautiful, Tyler. I love the word negotiate that you use there, because that seems to be quite useful. The other thing Hairut and I was mentioning is we almost need to start thinking in philosophical gear, like packs, like backpacks and like going on a hike, as opposed to just philosophical models. And the notion of determining, like negotiating or thinking about or considering, like to what degree am I extrinsically motivated and that's good? And to what degree is it bad? To what degree am I saying I'm intrinsically motivated when really I'm just impulsive? Like to be able to engage in that certain negotiation with the self, that's not going to be set in a stable state model, right? It's conditional. And it's conditional on the situation. When am I using a pen name in order to get into a system that otherwise I could not get into? And when am I in fact using a pen name that's really something more like a mask so that I can create a false reality to escape facing my spouse because I don't want to encounter the real of them, right? You would have to engage in that negotiation with themselves, right? When are you engaging in a rebellion to actually overthrow the system that has you riding a bicycle to collect points? And when are you just doing that so that you can be the most popular actor on the game show of people that come together engaging in rebellion, right? There has to be a negotiation. There is not simply the answer is A or the answer is B. It would all be dependent on you and your conditionality and what you are thinking and what you are doing. For too long, if you have a philosophy of certainty, if you want to use that language, that doesn't provide you with those resources, right? Because you just need to know what's the right thing to do. Oh, we're going to rebel against the system or whatever, right? And you're not therefore carrying the right gear to be ready for what they do when they offer you a primetime spot pretending like you're going to commit suicide, right? You're not ready for that because you didn't bring the right gear. You did not bring the right conditioning. Likewise, you are not ready for how you are to respond when you find yourself at the circus, right? You did not condition yourself accordingly. So I think thinking in terms of philosophy, in terms of applied metaphysics, that's a nice phrase, Tyler, in terms of action, in terms of philosophical gear, in terms of these journeys, there's these metaphors matter, and the metaphoric schemas that we bring with ourselves will affect in the way that we absorb the information. And I think in thinking metaphorically, philosophy in more of these terms, story, journey, gear, hike, action, different things like that, I think that can transform our relationship to a lot of these concepts so we don't end up so neurotic or pathological because we're all intrinsically motivated without any consideration of the other, so we're an egotist, or we're all extrinsically motivated without any cultivation of inner wonder, and as a result, we're delusion captured, right? To avoid those ditches is, I think, dialectical thinking in general.
Well, that's beautiful. And I just want to add on it because I think this is where, this is kind of where I see choice and paradox intersect. Because a paradox in some sense is a statement, it's two statements about worlds which can't coexist, right? And so it's a place where they cannot coexist. So an unstoppable force and an immovable object can't both simultaneously exist within the same world. They exclude each other, right? So I cannot both desire a thing and to be unable to achieve it. There's some paradoxical relationship there which causes a sense of choice, right? And that sense of choice is what I identify with as the self, right? It's not the choices that have been made, but the ability to choose. That's that move, which is the diagonal move, right? It's not the purely intrinsic, always already occurring state, but it is the capacity to participate in the creation of that ongoing state. Well, okay, no, Emilio, can you expound on that? Like, you cannot desire to fly like a bird. So if we take some evolutionary developmental model, or what does that mean in that context, right? So this is where I want to know where information comes from. If you're talking about relationships between intrinsic and extrinsic, and neither are, where does new body plan come from? Right? Where does actual information about structural functional organization come from? Is it extrinsic? What is it about the environment that determines the shape of claws? What is it about the environment that determines the shape of the wings? Right? It's this enormous interlocking web of, let's say, suggestions for potential body plans. the density of air suggests a certain surface air ratio for wings, right, to weight. There's all this stuff that you can play within, but that landscape of possibility, where does the intrinsic structure come from that is in response to that arena of potentiality?
Walmart? Not Walmart? What about Food Line? Does information come from there? Shoot, dang it. No, that's a very profound question. But again, that sort of notion that there is an intrinsic, I guess people, you get the relation between the extrinsic and the intrinsic and different things like that. I mean, once you start talking about information in that way, in the participation in that information, that in that information, that brings with it a certain existential anxiety that being able to hold that would require a certain developmentism to get to. And I will just note, what's happening today, I think, as the need for A/B thinking, and I'll let Emilio respond, is becoming more and more clear. That's where the temptation to return to some big other or some one of a patriarchy or fascism or like central system is very, very tempting, because that can abstain from you the necessity to engage in dialectical thinking or even ask questions like you're just asking there, Tyler, on the relation between information and development, the intrinsic and the extrinsic. You start doing all that, well, then every single day gets a little more complex and difficult, and I'm going to have to pack my gear, and I don't want to do that. So I rather just vote for the politician to make America great again, or who's going to tear down the evil capture and beat the corporate. All of that has a way of creating a dynamic of returning to a existential stability, of which will save us from these considerations. And in many respects, this is suggesting, it's another topic and I won't get into it. This is where, for me, philosophy actually has massive consequences politically, socially, in relationships, because if you are still operating according to the wrong kind of epistemology, you feed right back in to various totalitarian movements, or you lack the resources to work with the other in a manner that doesn't smother difference. So it's all very consequential.
Well, I don't really have anything to add. Like, I don't think I can answer the question. I wrote like, you cannot desire to fly like a bird, in response of what you say, Tyler, because like for me, like it's for me it resounded like deeply, because we desire to get a new job, to get a new car, because those are things we feel we can do. We never like fantasize, oh, I wish I could fly like a bird. That's not like, that's not at least a common desire. That's at least not a common desire, let's say, because we don't desire what's not possible, what we don't think that's possible. So that for me was the intention about that, because I felt that really poignant. And so yeah, we don't desire what we don't think we can achieve. So that's why I say like, that's all I can say. What it was a really, and I really like the environment, like suggestions for wings, and I don't know how to explain. I was like seeing that in my head, and it was beautiful. Yeah, like that.
Oh, so philosophical anecdote. When I was sometime between 3 and 4, I climbed up on the top of the big kids slide, and I turned around, rather than going down the metal slide, I jumped head first off, because I had recently seen Superman, and I was convinced I could fly. I couldn't fly. I still remember the pain of impacting the ground and dirt in my eyes. But this is, and I won't take long. I just want to throw in Heidegger, perhaps. I'm not super well read in terms of traditional philosophical exploration, but this question of intrinsic and extrinsic is really interesting. So when I see a bird, I do actually want to fly like a bird. I remember very clearly as a child often thinking, I would love to fly like a bird. And I know Da Vinci had the same thoughts. And so he devised all sorts of weird mechanisms that were an attempt to supplement his inability to fly by copying from the external some tool, right? Which is this extrinsic projection of capacity that is not intrinsic. So this distinction between the development of an intrinsic capacity versus the supplemental aspect of developing some extrinsic tool is something that really matters in terms of the graspability of things, right? In terms of how we distinguish it as to whether or not it's a you or an it. And all that stuff. So,
well, no, and that, and then anyone else with any final thoughts, please, please feel free to speak. to me, this all suggests why I'm very interested. You know, a lot of times people will talk about the true self and finding your true self and different things like that. And of course, there can be problems with that, thinking about self-relating negativity and different things. It makes me think, you know, Michelle and I were talking about, maybe we need to talk more about the motivated self, finding the motivated self. And I know the word self can be a problem, even in the language of certain philosophical schemas, but we have thought about finding like a true self, as if there's some transcendental signifier that we can locate and be like, ah, that's it. When really there's something else going on and finding a motivated self, which seems to have some sort of negotiation going on. Because how do you negotiate the fact that I know in my determinations, I cannot be a bird, but maybe analogically, you know, analogy, like the analogy of being sort of thing, I can do something like a bird. It would seem that what ends up happening is we operate in this like space, and then you get this long philosophical, theological tradition of the analogy of being, and that would be another topic, which is coming to terms with necessity, but also having freedom to try to conform necessity to be more like an alternative. Which then becomes like, that's creation, right? And that's kind of the unique creative abilities that humans have. So those are thoughts I have. If anyone else has any final thoughts, please.
I'll just briefly come in, and because I really like this flying conversation here, I want to say, like, when we talk about the bird flying, right? What's interesting is that we as humans gave the designation, the impossible designation of a bird flying, right? The bird's not going to say, hey, I'm flying. All right. We are the ones that gave the descriptor that this bird is flying by studying its mechanics, and we say, oh, it is flying. So what's interesting about this is that we gave the designation of the impossible. But the funny thing is, the impossible has a reflection of what shows possible, meaning that we could create airplanes. We could create things that basically, this is a reflection of becoming of what we already are, right? It reveals the capacity of what the human is already capable of. The mistake is that we try to do an A for an A, right? The A for an A is, I wish I was a bird and I could fly, and I wish I had wings, right? Like, you want actual wings, right? That's the A logic, in my opinion. And that's like the thing. And in my opinion, you have to go through that failure to be like, oh, I can't do that. So all of a sudden it makes you do a turn, and they say, okay, I can't actually be a bird, but I can be like a bird. And the question is, how do I do that? And then, of course, it's going to follow suit into motivation and everything else. But yeah, I thought that was like very interesting, the way that was phrased.
Well, you are all beautiful people. And I will say to that, the closing thoughts on it is, I think it points to how there's something necessary about failure in development, like philosophical development, which then, speaking to conversations I've had with all of you, or Cadell or Chita, and all of you, is if academia and philosophy is in the business of avoiding shocks to the ego and avoiding, losing their idols or different things like that, then it would precisely be in the business of not engaging in the practices that necessarily entail failure by which philosophical development occurs. And so that would suggest the entire system that is erected for philosophical incubation on the academic level might be problematic, and just contributing to us always performing in a circus that we can't escape, and that the clapping just starts to something that at the end of the day is empty and hollow. But I've enjoyed this very much. We will do it again next week. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And you are all awesome. I always enjoy this very much. Thank you all.